How is Game of Thrones, a show loosely based on the 15th century War of the Roses, representative of our cultural moment? How are the tropes it draws upon and the structure of the narrative a product of the latter half of the 20th century? Unlike many of its predecessors, it's fundamentally a postmodern show, a show that decentres and problematizes timeless devices like the hero's journey, teleological storytelling with an end, and narrative realism. Game of Thrones is actually about how power subjectifies, how even the players at the top are moved by a diversity of forces greater than they are. It's also postmodern in the obvious sense that it draws upon the real past in ways that it picks and chooses. It's magical realism too, and a collage of historical characters and ethical dilemmas. But this obligatory Game of Thrones post-mortem is not going to be another video about how the last season dropped the ball. Instead, I want to talk about the idea of Game of Thrones, why the concept resonated so well culturally. I think the entire ethos of the show can be summed up in this scene where Varys asks Tyrion where he thinks power lies.
3 great men sit in a room, a king, a priest, and a rich man. Between them stands a common sellsword. Each great man bids the sellsword kill the other 2. Who lives, who dies?
Depends on the sellsword.
Does it? He has neither crown nor gold, nor favor with the gods.
He has a sword, the power of life and death.
But if it's swordsmen who rule, why do we pretend kings hold all the power? When Ned Stark lost his head, who was truly responsible? Joffrey, the executioner, or something else?
I've decided I don't like riddles.
Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall.
Game of Thrones is, of course, about power, that much is obvious, but understanding where men believe power lies is a cultural and social question. This is a story about stories, about narratives within the narrative, about what the masses of Westeros believe, who they'll support and why. These narratives are unspoken, only hinted at through the conversations of the main characters, who themselves try to understand and negotiate through. It's not a story about how important figures grapple with their own power. It's about how well they understand the power around them, the power that has an effect on them. But why is this of our moment? Well, politics is where power is most visible, most immediate. It addresses physical questions like who gets to speak and for who gets to exert authority and over who gets to define what's right and wrong, and who has a monopoly on violence and questions of property. This assumption that it's the political world where all of this goes on has been taken for granted for centuries. Traditionally, if you wrote a political history, you'd look at the central figures, the powerful kings and leaders, the presidents, the prime ministers, the great men of history. Still now, when we think of history, we think of Caesar, Napoleon, Churchill. But this assumption has been slowly changing. Walk into a history section of a bookshop today and you'll find a diversity of topics. Walk into a history department at a university and you'll find students analysing the effect of economic, social and cultural factors. In fact, political history is in a state of crisis, and it has been for over half a century now. This crisis has been the result of cultural, linguistic and social turns in the academic world since World War II. Recent trends have meant that rather looking towards high politics, the corridors of power, historians have become more interested in the broader trends that precede and move these figures. The point of the exchange between Varys and Tyrion is that the main characters, kings, emperors, priests, and our politicians and leaders, are the product of the culture, the social dynamics, the context, the structures, institutional rules and norms and linguistic possibilities that they enter into. They're subjectified by the world around them, and so understanding that social world that, for example, Napoleon lived in, becomes more important than studying Napoleon himself. But the question of how to bring high politics and wider society together is a difficult one. How do we think about culture and economics and sociology and power, and the people that sign bills, enact laws and win elections? New political history is a subdiscipline that's been trying to do just that. Political historians have always looked at autobiography, personal letters and witness accounts to explain why political figures acted in the way they did, but they're now starting to consider the setting, the wider physical environments, the constraints and the cultures that these historical actors moved in. Zeynep Tufekci has argued in Scientific America that Game of Thrones has done something similar. It was, in the seasons adapted from George R.R. Martin's material at least, a sociological story. This is why the show was able to kill off major characters and still hold your attention, because when Ned Stark dies and Robb replaces him in the next series, you understand that Robb's motives, his problems, his understanding of the world are similar to Ned's. The character isn't Ned Stark or Robb Stark. It's the Stark house, the North, Winterfell's walls, the Northerners' ignorance of the politics of the South, their honour and the problems that come with it. As Tufekci points out, understanding Hitler's personality tells us little about fascism. Instead, we must look to the economic conditions, the history of anti-Semitism, the political problems the Weimar Republic faced. Compare Game of Thrones with Lord of the Rings, written in the 40s and very much a product of modernism. Lord of the Rings is about character. It's about the heroes confronting their inner problems and fears to live up to their potential that's deep within themselves. It's great men-centric. It's also teleological. It has a progressive linear narrative with an end, and of course is about good and evil. Compare this to the first season of Game of Thrones. It seems like Ned Stark's the hero. In many ways he still is, but it's more about his inability to comprehend the structures around him, the politics, the culture and the norms of King's Landing down south. Walled in, safe and stable in the north, the Starks spent their time thinking about family, honour and ethics, how to be a good person, how to hunt well, being true to your word. That understanding of the world worked for Ned in the north, but down in King's Landing, where people are vying for power, scheming, lying, being honourable didn't get him far. This is distinctly Bourdieuian, a 20th century French theorist whose writings sit at the intersection between modernity and postmodernity. Pierre Bourdieu was interested in how the unspoken rules of society have an effect on how we act. For Bourdieu, we embody both history and the physical world around us. Our consciousness is like a maze that's been built and moulded by the rest of the world, the walls of which represent the routines, norms, rules, physical obstacles and challenges that we meet in the real world. The social world, the layout of the city, the language we use, the way we've been raised becomes encoded in us in what he calls habitus. In a very basic way, our thought about what to do and where to go is dictated by bus timetables and train networks, for example. What to wear is determined by cultural norms like expectations in a job interview. Bourdieu enjoys the metaphor of a game. Life is about getting a feel for the game, what he calls strategies. It's not clear that Frodo has to get a feel for any social, cultural or political game in Lord of the Rings. His narrative is about finding inner strength and powering on. Robb Stark, on the other hand, begins to understand the rules of the game when he promises to marry one of Walder Frey's daughters so that his army can cross the Frey's bridge, but of course reneges on his promise, losing what Bourdieu would call social capital with the Freys and, well, you know. The historian R.G. Collingwood argued that individuals negotiate a world crowded with people pursuing activities of their own. People must design their own path so that it best fits into the desires of the rest. He wrote that for a man about to act, the situation is his master, his oracle, his god. Whether his action is to prove successful or not depends on whether he grasps the situation rightly or not. When Tolkien was writing Lord of the Rings, the idea of high politics was one of a closed world, independent from the sheep and the common people. Tywin, on the other hand, tries to teach Jaime that to understand and respond to the people is to understand the game.
He's a Lannister. He might be the lowest of the Lannisters, but he's one of us. And every day that he remains a prisoner, the less our name commands respect.
So the Lion does concern himself with the opinions
No, that's not an opinion, it's a fact. If another house can seize one of our own and hold him captive with impunity, we are no longer a house to be feared.
Michel Foucault saw the world in a similar way. Power is everywhere. It orders and organises the world in such a way that we can't help but be a product of it, rather than it being a product of us. He wrote, "Power is not something that is acquired, seized or shared, something that one holds onto or allows to slip away. Power is exercised from innumerable points, in the interplay of non-egalitarian and mobile relations." It's not that high politicians don't have power, it's that even more so, the networks of relationships, possibilities, limitations and resources around them direct power and shape power in a way that they must navigate through. Joffrey thinks he has the ultimate power, but he misunderstands where it really lies. In Tywin's armies, yes, but also in understanding how the game works, in Littlefinger and Varys's little birds, in the right balance between the great houses, the right marriages, the right plays, the right respect. The German sociologist Max Weber argued that any real understanding of politics needed to analyse three areas: political leadership, how political figures claim legitimacy, whether by referencing ethics or political philosophy or by elections or upbringing, and the structure, the reach of the state apparatus in which these figures act. And it's this third area that we, historians included, are only just beginning to understand. Looking at how the structure of the state, of culture and of political economy affects people, moulds subjects, coerces, we can see how recently this has had an effect on the writing of history by looking at a subject matter similar to Game of Thrones, early modern Italian diplomacy. Isabella Lazarini's Communication and Conflict, Italian Diplomacy in the Early Renaissance 1350 to 1520, for example, was only published in 2015. The methodology that she uses expands upon what was a very ambassador-centric model of diplomatic history in the past. Lazzarini argues that four neglected but fundamental areas deserved attention: negotiation, information gathering, representation, and communication, and all through a cultural and social lens. In this way, what the ambassador could achieve is not just about the ambassador's character traits as charm, it's about who he has capital with: clergy, artists, merchants, community leaders, how he understands their rituals and hierarchies, and his experience negotiating the physical spaces all of this took place in. And similarly, Massimo Rospoccia's work shows that even in the early modern period, political communication and rhetoric wasn't simply a product of an elite world, the corridors of power closed off from contact with common people. Rospoccia analyses episodes where we can see how language and culture flows through communities affecting high and low politics alike. One episode describes a song being sung by an official at an assembly about the Pope, leading to a piece of graffiti being discovered about the song on a wall in the town, which leads to an investigation and a shoemaker being tortured and jailed. In light of our understanding that power is diffuse, that it flows through communities, objects and language, different disciplines have turned to theorise the processes by which this happens in similar ways. And while it's not clear that George R.R. Martin was ever a student of this kind of thought, he himself has described the difference between Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings in this way. In an interview he said, "Lord of the Rings had a very medieval philosophy. that if the king was a good man, the land would prosper. We look at real history and it's not that simple. Tolkien can say that Aragorn became king and reigned for 100 years and he was wise and good, but Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy? Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? And what about all those orcs? Martin was also heavily influenced by Tad Williams' series Memory, Sorrow and Thorn, whose own influences read like a who's who of postmodern authors, including Thomas Pynchon and Jorge-Luis Borges. I'm not arguing that Martin was directly or explicitly influenced by any of these postmodern thinkers. There's no evidence that he's read Bourdieu or Foucault, but the effect of these philosophers, of a deepening of academic theory, has slowly permeated into mainstream discourse, into novels, journalism, the news, television. I think this is also why Game of Thrones was always going to be difficult to end. Postmodern stories don't end. Like life, they keep on going. People are rarely heroes and villains. They have moments of heroism and villainy. And so is it possible to actually break the will? Well, in the end, I think that if you like these videos, I need your help, and here's my request. If you think you get the same value from 4 of these videos as you do from just 1 cup of coffee, then please consider pledging just $1 per video. That's $3 to $4 per month to keep this channel going. You can even limit your pledge to $1 a month, and if you pledge $5, I'll add your name to the credits. To those that already support then and now, thank you so much. This channel just wouldn't exist without you. You can also hit like, share, follow me on Twitter and Facebook, etc. All of these things really contribute to helping then and now grow. Thanks for watching and see you next week.